The house had been empty for 3 months before anyone found the courage to open it. Boxes sat stacked in the hallway. A daughter stood in the kitchen, holding a roll of masking tape, trying to decide where to start. It was supposed to be simple. Sort what stays, sort what goes, call it done by Sunday. It was not simple. Behind the flour canister, wrapped in a dish towel that had not been touched in years, sat a small paper bag of sugar. Not the sugar she was using, a second bag, hidden. In the linen closet, folded so carefully it looked untouched, was fabric that had never become a dress, a curtain, or anything at all. Just fabric, waiting. Between the pages of a cookbook nobody ever cooked from, there was money. Not much. A few worn bills, flattened smooth, tucked in like a bookmark for a story only she knew. At first, it was funny. The grandchildren laughed. She really did save everything, didn't she? Someone joked about the candles in the junk drawer, the bars of soap stacked 3 deep under the sink, the aspirin bottles that expired before some of them were even born. But the laughter did not last through the whole house. Because as the boxes kept opening, a pattern started to appear. It was not clutter, it was not carelessness. Every hiding place had a purpose. Every item was something a person could not live without if the world outside stopped cooperating for a while. Sugar, in case the store shelves emptied again. Soap, in case money disappeared before the month did. Cash, in case the bank could not be trusted to open its doors. Somewhere in that house, a family raised on refrigerators, credit cards, and same-day delivery began to understand that they were not looking at a woman's habits. They were looking at a woman's memory. She had grown up in a decade when the world took everything away without asking permission. Banks closed their doors overnight. Paychecks stopped coming. Food that used to be ordinary became something people begged for. She had been a child then, or barely more than one, and children do not forget the year the adults around them stopped pretending everything was fine. She carried that decade with her long after it ended, through better years, through a full pantry, through a life where, by any reasonable measure, she had enough. But enough was never a number to her. Enough was a feeling she had learned, the hard way, not to trust. This is the story of what a family found when they finally opened her house. Not just sugar behind the pots, or soap under the sink, or a few dollars folded into a cookbook. They found a system. A quiet, careful, almost invisible defense built by a woman who had once watched safety disappear in a single season, and who spent the rest of her life making sure it would never catch her unprepared again. By the end, the family was not laughing anymore. They were asking why they had never asked her about any of it while she was still alive to answer. To understand what that house was really saying, you have to go back before the house existed at all. Before the marriage, before the children, before the sugar behind the pots, or the money folded into a cookbook nobody used. You have to go back to a girl who was young enough to still believe adults knew what they were doing, right up until the year she learned they did not. She would have been a small child when the banks began closing their doors. Not one bank in one town. Waves of them, across the country, in a matter of months. A family could go to sleep believing their savings were safe, and wake up to a locked door and a notice taped to the glass. There was no app to check, no customer service line, no guarantee stamped on anything. Money that had taken years to save simply stopped existing, and there was no one to complain to, because the people in charge were just as confused as everyone else. For a child watching that happen to the adults around her, the lesson was not complicated. It was this: the things you count on can disappear without warning, and when they do, no one is coming to explain why. That lesson does not stay in childhood. It moves in. It becomes furniture. By the time she was old enough to run her own kitchen, the Depression years were technically over. The calendar said so. But the body does not read calendars. The body remembers what it lived through, and it makes decisions accordingly, often long after the danger has passed, and often without the person even realizing they are still responding to something that ended decades ago. This is where the sugar comes in, not as a saving tip, as a symptom of something much older. In many American homes during those years, sugar was not simply an ingredient. It was one of the first things to vanish when money got tight, and one of the last things a family could easily replace once it was gone. A kitchen without sugar could still make bread, it could still make soup, but it could not make anything that felt like comfort, and in a house already stripped of comfort, that mattered more than it sounds like it should. So when this woman, decades later, tucked a second bag of sugar behind the everyday canister, she was not being strange. She was closing a gap that had once nearly broken her family's ability to feel normal. She was making sure that if the ordinary bag ran out at the worst possible moment, there would still be something in the house that let her make a cake for a birthday, or cookies for a grandchild, or simply a cup of coffee that tasted like a good day instead of a hard one. The grandchildren, finding that hidden bag decades later, saw an old woman with an odd habit. What they were actually looking at was a girl who once watched her mother stretch half a cup of sugar across 3 weeks, learning in real time that comfort was not guaranteed, and deciding, without ever saying it out loud, that she would never again let her own family feel that particular kind of absence. But here is the part nobody likes to admit. This was not really about sugar at all. Sugar was simply the first hiding place the family happened to find. Once they knew to look, the rest of the house started talking. Under the bathroom sink, past the towels no one used for guests anymore, sat soap. Not one bar, several, wrapped and stacked, untouched for what looked like years. To a family raised in a world of endless refills and same-day delivery, that looked like hoarding. To a woman raised in a world where soap could become a luxury overnight, it looked like insurance. During the hardest years of the Depression, small comforts like soap were often the first casualties of a shrinking budget. Families cut corners in places outsiders would never notice. A bar of soap stretched thinner and thinner, used until it was nearly nothing, because buying a new one meant admitting there was no room left in the budget for anything but survival. For a child in that house, watching a parent hesitate over something as small as soap taught a lesson that never really left. Some comforts are not optional. They are dignity, disguised as something ordinary. So when this woman built her own home, soap was never going to be something she gambled on. She kept enough behind that sink to survive a stretch of bad luck, without anyone in her house ever having to feel the particular shame of going without something so basic. It was not vanity. It was a promise she had made to a version of herself that once stood in a bathroom, watching a sliver of soap disappear, wondering what would happen when it did. The family did not know any of this while they stood there holding the bars in their hands, half laughing, half confused. They knew it later. Everyone in that house learned the truth of her habits, about 30 minutes too late to ask her about them directly. The linen closet held a different kind of story. Folded fabric, some of it decades old, sat stacked with a precision that suggested it had never once been disturbed. Not scraps, not remnants. Whole lengths of cloth, saved and never used, waiting for a need that, as far as anyone could tell, never actually arrived. To understand this, you have to remember what clothing meant to a family living through hard years. It was not something you replaced when it wore out. It was something you repaired, let out, took in, and passed down until there was genuinely nothing left to salvage. A torn coat did not mean a trip to the store. It meant patience, a needle, and whatever fabric could be found to make it last one more winter. For a woman raised inside that reality, fabric was never just fabric. It was the difference between a child going to school properly dressed and a child going to school in something falling apart at the seams. It was the material version of being ready, in case the ordinary source of clothing, money, mostly, ever failed again, the way it once had. She never used that fabric. That is the detail that stopped the family cold when they finally understood it. She kept it folded and ready for 40, maybe 50 years, through a life that, by any outside measure, never forced her to need it. The emergency that Fabric was waiting for simply never came. And this is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable. Because the honest question is not, why did she save all this? The honest question is, what would it have taken for her to actually believe she didn't need to anymore? And the answer, for a lot of people shaped by that decade, is that nothing ever fully convinced them. Not a steady job, not a paid-off house, not grandchildren growing up in a different, easier world. The fear that had been planted in childhood did not require ongoing evidence to survive. It only required one hard season, once, early enough in a life to leave a mark that comfort could soften but never entirely erase. That is a very different story than "she liked to keep things." That is a story about a girl who was taught, in the cruelest classroom imaginable, that the world can take away comfort, safety, and certainty all at once, without asking, and that the only real defense is to make sure you are never standing empty-handed when it happens again. The modern family, moving through her house box by box, had never been taught anything like that. Not because they were careless people, but because the world had simply never required it of them the same way. Grocery stores stayed open, paychecks arrived on schedule. If something ran out, another one was an app away, delivered before dinner. Their pantries were often full, but their preparedness, in the way this woman understood the word, was close to non-existent. Not because they were foolish, because they had never once needed to learn otherwise. That contrast is not an accident, it is the whole point of the house. A pantry stocked for convenience and a pantry stocked for survival can look almost identical from the outside. Shelves full, boxes stacked, nothing obviously missing. But one of those pantries exists because a delivery app makes running out feel impossible to imagine. The other exists because a person once lived through a version of the world where running out was not an abstract fear. It was Tuesday. The grandchildren, standing in her kitchen, were the product of the first kind of home. She had built the second kind, quietly, for her entire adult life, and never once explained why, because to her, it did not need explaining. It was simply how a responsible person lived. You did not wait for the bad season to arrive before preparing for it. You prepared, silently, every single day, so that if it ever came again, it would find your house ready instead of desperate. That difference, between a house that reacts and a house that already has an answer, is the entire inheritance this woman left behind, tucked into drawers, closets, and the backs of cabinets nobody thought to check until she was gone. But the deepest part of the story was not in the sugar, or the soap, or even the fabric. It was in what the family found next. A cookbook, worn soft at the corners, that none of them remembered her ever cooking from. And tucked inside its pages, flattened smooth by years of pressure, a small stack of bills. Nobody in that kitchen had ever seen her spend that money. Nobody had ever seen her mention it. It had simply been there, waiting inside a book she never opened for recipes, for longer than most of the people standing in that kitchen had been alive. That discovery is where the story turns. Cash hidden in a book is a strange thing to find in a house that clearly did not need it. There was a checking account. There was a savings account. Modest but steady, the kind any bank today would happily manage with a mobile app and a monthly statement. She did not need to hide money inside a cookbook. And yet she had, for years, maybe decades, tucked away where no bank could touch it, and no institution could freeze it without her permission. To understand that, you have to remember what a bank actually meant to someone who grew up when banks were failing by the thousands. During the worst stretch of those years, a family could do everything right, save carefully, deposit responsibly, trust the system exactly the way they were told to, and still lose everything in a single morning because the bank itself simply stopped being solvent and there was no government promise yet in place to make anyone whole again. People stood outside locked doors, holding passbooks that had suddenly become meaningless pieces of paper, watching their entire financial history evaporate behind glass they were no longer allowed to walk through. For a child who witnessed that, even from a distance, even secondhand through a parent's frightened face, the lesson was not banks are dangerous. The lesson was something quieter and more permanent. Never let all of your safety live in one place, controlled by someone else, no matter how official that someone else appears. That is not paranoia. That is precisely the kind of thinking a person develops after watching trust get punished once, decisively, in front of them. So when this woman, decades into a stable, ordinary, unremarkable financial life, still kept a small stack of cash folded into the pages of a book no one ever opened, she was not distrusting her bank specifically. She was maintaining a habit that had once been the only thing standing between her family and total helplessness. A little money that answered to no institution. A little safety that no closed door could take from her. It was never a large amount. That detail matters. This was not a woman secretly wealthy and pretending otherwise. It was a woman making sure that if the world ever did what it had done once before, she would not be standing at a locked door with absolutely nothing in her hands. The family, holding those worn bills in the kitchen, did not know any of that history in the moment. They just knew it felt strange to find money in a cookbook. It took piecing together the sugar and the soap and the fabric, and now this, before anyone said the sentence that changed the whole afternoon. She wasn't just saving things. She was still getting ready. That same discipline appeared in another corner of the house, in a place that made the family go quiet for an entirely different reason. In a small cabinet near her bed, they found medicine, not current medicine, bottles well past any reasonable expiration, some of them with labels faded almost to nothing. Aspirin and basic remedies kept far longer than any pharmacist would recommend. To modern eyes, that looks like neglect or confusion, or the beginning of some decline no one had noticed in time. To someone who grew up when a doctor's visit was a luxury many families simply could not afford, it looks like something else entirely. During those hard years, medical care was not the guaranteed, insured, always available thing it can feel like today. A trip to a doctor cost real money that a family often did not have, and for a lot of households, home remedies and whatever medicine was already on hand were the only line of defense against illness until things improved enough to afford anything more. Running out of the basics did not just mean discomfort. It could mean genuinely having nothing to offer a sick child except patience and worry. A person raised inside that reality does not think of medicine as something you buy when you need it. She thinks of it as something you must already have, because needing it and being able to afford it were never guaranteed to happen at the same time. So she kept it, long after doctors were affordable, long after pharmacies were a short drive away, long after any reasonable person would have thrown those bottles out and replaced them with something fresh. Because throwing them out meant trusting, completely, that she would never again be caught without options, and that was never a trust she fully allowed herself to feel. This is where the modern kitchen and the modern medicine cabinet and the modern idea of preparedness started to look very different from hers. A house today can be full, refrigerators stocked, cabinets organized, prescriptions refillable with a phone call, and still not be prepared in the way this woman understood the word. Modern preparedness usually means having access. Her preparedness meant having possession. Access depends on the world continuing to cooperate, the store staying open, the pharmacy staying stocked, the delivery driver showing up on schedule. Possession depends on nothing but what is already sitting in your own house, under your own control, regardless of what the world outside decides to do. That is the quiet difference between a family that trusts the system and a woman who once watched the system fail completely and never fully believed it again. But even understanding all of that, one discovery in the house left the family more shaken than any of the others. Far in the back of a closet, wrapped carefully and clearly untouched, was something none of them expected, A dress, still folded in its original tissue, never worn. Not a costume. Not something purchased impulsively and later regretted. A genuinely good dress, the kind saved for an occasion, still exactly as it had been the day it arrived in that house. No one could say for certain when she got it, or why she never wore it. But everyone in that kitchen understood, almost instantly, what it represented. This was the item kept for a day that never came. A celebration she was saving herself for. That life, for whatever reason, never delivered. A wedding she did not attend. An anniversary that passed differently than planned. A moment of significance that simply slipped by, the way moments do, while the dress waited patiently in tissue paper for an invitation that stopped being relevant before she ever used it. There is something almost unbearable about finding an object like that. It is not sad in the way loss is usually sad. It is sad in a quieter, more specific way, the sadness of readiness that outlived its purpose. She had prepared, faithfully, for a moment worth preparing for, and the moment, in the end, simply never arrived to meet her. That dress said something the sugar and the soap and the fabric could not say quite as clearly. Her preparedness was not only about disaster, it was also about hope. She was not only guarding against the worst day, she was also holding a place open for a good one, just in case it came. It never did, not in the specific form she had imagined, but she kept the dress anyway, the same way she kept the sugar and the fabric and the cash folded into a cookbook, because letting go of any of it would have meant admitting that the future she was preparing for was no longer coming. And that is a harder thing to admit than it sounds. Here is where the family's understanding of her finally cracked open completely. Someone remembered a story from years earlier, one nobody had thought much about at the time. A neighbor down the street had gone through a hard stretch, the kind of ordinary hard stretch that happens to almost every family eventually. A lost job, an unexpected bill, a month where the math simply did not work. And this woman, without hesitation, without ceremony, had opened her own cabinets and given away exactly the kind of things she normally never touched. Soap, sugar, a little cash, quietly, in an envelope that was never mentioned again by either of them. She did not lecture the neighbor about budgeting. She did not make it a moment. She simply opened the reserve she had spent a lifetime maintaining, handed over what was needed, and closed the cabinet again as if nothing unusual had happened. That is the detail that reframes everything the family found in her house. This was never about hoarding out of fear, the way it looked from the outside. It was about being the kind of person who could actually help when it mattered, instead of the kind of person who wanted to help but had nothing set aside to help with. Her preparedness was not selfish. It was, in its own quiet way, a form of generosity that required no audience and expected no thanks. She was not stockpiling in case she alone needed it. She was stockpiling in case someone she loved needed it, and she wanted to be the kind of woman who could simply open a cabinet and solve a problem, instead of the kind who had to say, helplessly, that she wished she could do something. That is not the behavior of someone broken by fear. That is the behavior of someone who took a hard lesson from a hard decade and turned it into a lifelong form of care. The modern home, by comparison, often cannot do what she did without friction. A family today, facing the same neighbor's hard month, is more likely to reach for a credit card, a loan, or an awkward conversation about what they can spare, because very few households keep an actual physical reserve of the basics anymore. Not because people today are less generous, because almost nothing in modern life teaches anyone to keep that kind of reserve in the first place. The whole system is built around access instead of possession, credit instead of cash, delivery instead of storage. It works, most of the time, but it works only as long as everything around it keeps working too. She had learned, the hard way, that everything around you can stop working all at once, and she spent the rest of her life making sure that if it ever happened again, at least her own house would not be one of the ones caught without an answer. The family stood in that kitchen for a long time after they understood all of this. Nobody was laughing anymore. the sugar, the soap, the fabric, the cash, the dress, the expired bottles of medicine, none of it looked like an old woman's clutter anymore. It looked like a system, built quietly over decades, by someone who had once been a child standing outside a locked bank door, and who decided, without ever saying so out loud, that she would spend the rest of her life making sure her own family never stood at a door like that again. A Depression-era habit did not disappear when the decade ended. It stayed in drawers, kitchens, and a mother's careful hands for the rest of her life, and in this house, it stayed there long enough for her grandchildren to finally find it, years too late to ask her the one question they all wished, standing in that kitchen, that they had thought to ask while she was still alive to answer it. Why did you keep all of this? They will never get her actual answer, but standing in that house, surrounded by everything she had quietly prepared for, they did not really need one anymore. What that family found, box by box, was never really about sugar, or soap, or fabric, or a few worn bills folded into a cookbook. It was about a woman who once watched the world take away every certainty she had, at an age too young to understand why, and who spent the rest of her life quietly making sure it could never do that to her family again. She was not eccentric. She was not overly cautious for no reason. She was a person who had learned, in the hardest classroom there is, that comfort, safety, and stability are not guarantees. They are things you build, protect, and refuse to take for granted, even decades after the danger that taught you that lesson has long since passed. She was poor once, in a decade that made poverty feel like it could happen to anyone, without warning, without mercy. But she was never helpless, not then, and not in all the years that followed. Every hidden bag of sugar, every bar of soap, every folded length of fabric, every dollar tucked out of sight, was proof of that. She turned a childhood fear into a lifelong form of quiet strength, and then she turned that strength into something even better, a way of loving people without ever needing to say the words out loud. If this brought back a memory of your own mother, father, or grandmother, someone who saved things you never understood until much later, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments what you found, or what you wish you had asked before it was too late. Share it with someone in your family who remembers a drawer, a closet, or a cabinet just like this one. Your memory might be the reason someone else finally understands theirs.